Case 1. Jordan Lynn Graham. On the 7th of July 2013, just 8 days after her wedding ceremony, a 22-year-old Montana woman drove her new husband to a remote clifftop trail inside Glacier National Park, led him along the edge of a canyon with a near 200-foot drop, and when an argument broke out between them, placed both hands on his back and shoved him off the edge. He fell. He did not survive. And when investigators came looking for answers, she had already been home for hours, not calling for help, not reporting what happened, but quietly building a set of false stories designed to point suspicion somewhere else entirely. Jordan Lynn Graham was 22 years old at the time. Her newlywed husband was Cody Lee Johnson, 25, and trusting her completely. The controversy this case carries is whether what happened at the edge of that cliff was a sudden, desperate reaction, or something she had already decided before she ever led him there. That question shaped every argument made in federal court. But what could push a newlywed to reach a decision that catastrophic, that fast? And was it truly a decision at all? Let's break down exactly what happened. Jordan Lynn Graham was 22 years old when she married Cody Lee Johnson in Kalispell, Montana, on June 29, 2013. Johnson was 25. The two had known each other for less than 2 years before the wedding took place. The ceremony happened. Photographs were taken. The day went forward the way wedding days are supposed to go. But the very next morning, Graham composed a text message to a friend and described what she called a meltdown. She wrote that she was questioning the commitment she had made less than 24 hours earlier. She expressed doubt about the relationship and uncertainty about what had brought her to that altar. That message, retrieved later by investigators, placed the origin of her doubt almost exactly at the beginning of the marriage itself. The doubt was not new. It had simply been invisible to the people around her. Over the following 7 days, that internal conflict did not settle. Prosecutors would later argue she began to consider how to exit the marriage without absorbing the social and personal cost of ending it so soon after the ceremony. Announcing the collapse of a marriage barely a week old would have demanded a certain kind of explanation to family and friends who had just celebrated the union. The question the prosecution eventually asked the court was whether the desire to avoid that difficulty had produced something deliberate. On the morning of July 7, 2013, 8 days after their wedding, Graham told Johnson she had a special surprise waiting for him. She persuaded him to cancel his existing plans for the day, including a kayaking trip with friends. He agreed and went with her. She drove them both to Glacier National Park and guided him along a section of the loop trail toward an elevated, exposed area near a cliff overlooking a canyon with a drop of nearly 200 feet. The two began arguing at the edge. In the days that followed, Graham produced several entirely different accounts of what had happened on that trail. She told friends and family that Johnson had gone hiking in the park with out-of-town acquaintances. She mentioned a person named Tony who allegedly had information about an accidental fall. Each version of events deteriorated as investigators examined it more closely. Eventually, under sustained questioning, Graham admitted she had pushed Johnson from behind with both hands. He went over the edge. He was 25 years old. He did not survive. The terrain below the trail was severe enough that investigators required a helicopter to assist in recovering his body. After leaving the park, Graham returned home. She did not call for emergency services. She did not report what had occurred. She began instead to construct and circulate narratives intended to direct attention elsewhere. That behavior, the false stories, the deliberate misdirection applied to friends, family, and law enforcement alike, became a significant element of her sentencing entirely separate from the act itself. It demonstrated not panic, but strategy. In December 2013, Graham's trial opened in federal court. Because the offense occurred inside a national park, it fell under federal jurisdiction rather than state law. She faced charges of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and making false statements to investigators. For days into the trial, she accepted a mid-trial plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to set aside the first-degree charge and the false statement count. The potential outcome shifted considerably from what a first-degree conviction might have meant. Sentencing occurred on March 27, 2014. The judge imposed 360 months, 30 years, in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. On the evening before that hearing, Graham filed a motion to withdraw her guilty plea. The court denied the motion. She broke down in the courtroom as the sentence was read. She appealed the conviction afterward, arguing the sentence was excessive and raising concerns about prosecutorial conduct. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied the appeal in 2015. The United States Supreme Court declined to review the case in 2016. She remains in federal custody. A projected release date approaches 2040. The question that the appeals courts could not resolve, and that the sentencing itself only partially answered, is the one about what Graham had actually planned. She described pushing Johnson in a reactive moment after he grabbed her arm during their argument. The prosecution pointed to the deliberate construction of the day, the promise of a surprise, the redirected plans, the isolated trail, the cliff she had guided him toward, and argued that the sequence pointed away from impulse and toward intent. The distinction between those two things is exactly what a second-degree conviction, as opposed to a first-degree one, is designed to measure. Johnson had planned to go horseback riding the following morning. He had agreed to cancel his kayaking trip because she told him something better was waiting. He had walked with her along that trail, 8 days into a marriage, entirely trusting that the surprise was real. Whatever Jordan Graham felt inside those 8 days, whatever combination of regret, desperation, or calculation shaped the choices she made on that afternoon in Glacier National Park, Cody Johnson had no visibility into any of it. He had no warning. He had no opportunity to simply choose to leave. That, as the court established, was the central fact of the case. Not the feeling of doubt, which is human, but the choice made at the edge of a 200-foot drop when every other option was still available and entirely within reach. Case 2. Lindsay April Haugen. On the evening of the 15th of September 2015, a 32-year-old female Army veteran sat with a 25-year-old man inside a parked SUV in a quiet corner of Billings, Montana, and then wrapped her arm around his neck and used her hands to seal off his airways. She held that position for as long as 20 minutes, according to court documents, until he stopped breathing. When investigators asked her why she had done it, she gave them an answer so disturbing and so blunt that it became the single sentence the public could not stop repeating, a sentence she would spend the next decade trying to take back. There is a particular kind of story that resists simple moral framing. It does not arrive with clear villains and clean edges. It arrives instead with context that complicates everything, with trauma that is real, with stated motives that are contradictory, and with a death at the center of it that cannot be undone regardless of how the narrative is arranged around it. The Lindsay April Haugen case is one of those stories. It draws attention not because the facts are difficult to locate, but because the facts, once located, do not resolve into the kind of certainty that most people who follow true crime cases expect to find. Lindsay April Haugen was 32 years old when she took Robert Mast's life. Mast was 25, and he struggled with severe depression. Some members of his own family ultimately forgave Haugen publicly. Others did not, and that family divide became one of the most painful and visible controversies in the entire case, playing out in courtrooms, in a Netflix documentary, and in a clemency hearing a decade later. What truly drove Lindsay Haugen to do what she did inside that parked vehicle? And did Robert Mast want what happened to him? Let's uncover the details behind this case. Haugen was 32 years old in the summer of 2015. She was an Army veteran and a former National Guard sergeant. In the months before that summer, she had escaped a severely abusive relationship. Her prior partner had committed offenses against her that resulted in his incarceration. He had been jailed for that abuse only 2 months before she met Robert Mast. The proximity of those two things, the escape from violence and the new relationship that followed almost immediately, matters when you try to understand how events progressed. Robert Mast was 25. He and Haugen met in Washington State in August of 2015. They connected quickly. Mast struggled with depression and, according to Haugen's account and the accounts of some of his family members, spoke openly during their brief relationship about wanting to die. The two began a road trip together, heading east toward North Dakota. They stopped in Billings, Montana, on September 15, 2015. They parked in the Heights area of the city. They ate pizza and drank wine together inside her SUV. What happened in that vehicle is something Haugen has described, recanted, and reframed across multiple settings, in police interviews, in court, in a Netflix documentary, and in a parole hearing a decade later. The core of what happened, as established by forensic evidence and her own admission, is that she wrapped her arm around Mast's neck and used her hands to seal off his airways. She maintained that hold for an extended period, as long as 20 minutes, according to court documents, until Mast was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead. She then performed CPR on him for approximately 30 minutes before calling for help. When investigators arrived, she appeared distraught. She later told them, in a police interview that would define how the public received the case, that she had wanted to know what it would feel like to end someone's life with her own hands. That statement became the sentence that followed her everywhere. It was quoted in court documents, in news coverage, and in the Netflix series. It was a sentence she would spend years trying to walk back. At a clemency hearing in January 2025, Haugen told the board she had made the statement only to stop aggressive police questioning. She said she regretted it and that it did not reflect reality. Whether that recantation changed anyone's view depended entirely on how much weight they had given the original statement. The assisted suicide dimension of the case generated its own controversy. Mast's biological mother and stepfather expressed forgiveness toward Haugen and visited her in prison. They framed his death partly through the lens of his depression and stated death wishes. His stepmother, who had also helped raise him, held an opposing view. She argued the narrative of merciful assistance was a constructed one, that it served Haugen's interests and diminished the reality of what Mast had lost. The family was divided in their grief, and that division played out in public. In April 2016, Haugen pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide. No trial took place. Montana does not recognize assisted suicide as a defense to deliberate homicide, and the plea resolved the case without a full evidentiary presentation. She was sentenced on June 22, 2016, by a judge in Yellowstone County District Court. Prosecutors had recommended 65 years. The judge imposed 60 years in the Montana Women's Prison in Billings. Haugen expressed remorse at sentencing. She said she understood she deserved to be held accountable. The sentencing did not end the controversy. The Netflix documentary amplified her narrative and brought the case to a new audience. Mast's stepmother publicly opposed Haugen's media participation and continued to advocate against early release. Parole eligibility arrived in September 2030 under the terms of the sentence. Whether that eligibility translates to release rests with the parole board and ultimately with the governor of Montana. Robert Mast was 25 years old. He was a person who, by several accounts, was in genuine psychological pain at the time of his death. Whatever weight his reported wishes carry in a moral analysis of this case, the law was clear about what the act constituted. The court was clear about how it would be treated. And the debate about whether a person can consent to their own death and whether another person acting on that consent bears criminal responsibility is a debate that Haugen's case brought into sharp focus without resolving it. It remains unresolved. Mast is still gone. And the question of what really happened inside that parked vehicle in Billings on an autumn evening in 2015 belongs now to the record rather than to either of the two people who were present. Case 3. Patricia Batts. Over the course of several months leading into early February of 2020, a grandmother in West Yellowstone, Montana, pulled her 12-year-old grandson out of school, cut off his contact with the outside world, withheld food from him as routine punishment, and oversaw a pattern of physical abuse inside her home so severe and so deliberately escalating that the judge, who later reviewed the evidence, including videos recorded on family cell phones, used the word malevolence to describe what had been done to the boy. On or around the 3rd of February, 2020, the child sustained a fatal blow to the back of his head from a wooden paddle. He was 12 years old. His name was James Alex Hurley, and the adults in that house had watched it all unfold. Some cases require you to examine not just what was done, but how long it was allowed to continue before anyone in a position to intervene chose to act. The death of 12-year-old James Alex Hurley is not a case that turns on a single impulsive moment. It is a case that turns on months, on a pattern that escalated gradually enough that those around it either normalized what they were witnessing or chose, for reasons the court would later address, to participate in it instead. That slow progression is part of what made the eventual sentencing so difficult for those who followed the case to sit with. The harm done to Alex was not hidden. It was carried out inside a family home, in front of people who made choices about what to do with what they saw. Patricia Batts was approximately 48 years old when these events unfolded. Alex had already lost his father. He was placed with family because family, in theory, means protection. The controversy surrounding this case lies not only in what was done to him, but in how long it continued, and in how many people were present and said nothing until it was too late. How does a child go from attending school and building friendships to disappearing entirely behind closed doors? And why did no one intervene in time? Let's get into the full story. Patricia Batts was the paternal grandmother of Alex Hurley. Alex moved into her home in West Yellowstone, Montana, after the death of his father, Batts' son, Tommy Tate. That loss was real, and it left Alex in need of stability. He was placed with the grandmother because family placement, in theory, offers a child the kind of care that institutional arrangements cannot replicate. Alex had some behavioral challenges that came with his background, but reports indicated he was adjusting. He was attending public school. He was building friendships. The beginning of his time in West Yellowstone carried some measure of hope. Then Batts removed him from school, and the household closed around him. What court records and sentencing documents later described was an environment in which Alex was treated not as a grieving child in need of care, but as a problem requiring escalating discipline. Food was withheld. Physical punishment was applied as a routine matter. Strenuous exercise was imposed as consequence. The household, which included Batts, her husband James Sasser Jr., their teenage children, and at times a family friend, became the entire world that Alex occupied. He had no school. He had no outside contact. He had no adult in his life who was making decisions in his interest. The abuse continued over months. Prosecutors described the treatment as systematic rather than reactive. Cell phone videos recovered from family devices during the investigation documented the conditions Alex endured and the punishments administered. The judge who presided at sentencing described those videos as among the most disturbing evidence he had encountered in his years on the bench. He used the word malevolence. He said the suffering inflicted on Alex was unnecessary by any measure and reflected not discipline, but something darker. It is worth holding that word, malevolence, because it is not a word judges use casually. It represents a specific moral and legal conclusion about what was witnessed inside that West Yellowstone home. Alex Hurley died on or around February 3rd, 2020. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of his head. The fatal injury was delivered by Batts' 14-year-old son, Alex's young uncle, using a wooden paddle. He was a teenager carrying out what had been normalized within that household as an acceptable form of discipline. The failure extended in multiple directions at once. After Alex collapsed from his injuries, Batts did not call for emergency services. She did not seek medical attention for him. She made a different choice. She began attempting to manage the narrative. She spoke to family members about what to say and what not to say to investigators. That conduct resulted in a separate witness tampering charge against her. Alex's body was eventually discovered. The investigation that followed brought multiple members of the household into the legal process simultaneously. James Sasser Jr., Batts' husband, pleaded guilty to charges related to his role and received 100 years in prison in 2022. Their son, who was 14 or 15 at the time of the fatal injury, was handled through the youth court system and sentenced to detention until age 18, followed by probation until 25. A family friend named Gage Roush, who had also been involved in assaultive acts against Alex, received a deferred sentence. Patricia Batts was the last of those charged to face sentencing. In the period leading up to her own resolution, prosecutors in Gallatin County had initially filed notice of intent to seek the death penalty. Montana law permits capital punishment in certain aggravated deliberate homicide cases, and the circumstances surrounding Alex's death, the prolonged torture element, the age of the victim, the multiple participants, were cited as aggravating factors that could have supported a capital charge. In early 2023, the incoming prosecutor decided against pursuing execution and instead negotiated a plea agreement. In May of 2023, Batts pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide, felony criminal child endangerment, and witness tampering. Sentencing occurred in August 2023 before District Judge John Brown in Bozeman. Batts received a life sentence for the homicide charge, with 2 concurrent 10-year terms for the remaining counts. Alex's mother, Alicia Davis, delivered a victim impact statement. Other relatives submitted written statements to the court. The judge's language at sentencing reflected the weight of what the record contained. He did not moderate his assessment of what had been done to Alex. He called it wholly unnecessary. He called it malevolent. He imposed the sentence that the plea agreement had established. Batts, who was approximately 51 at sentencing, is now serving her life sentence at the Montana Women's Prison. Alex Hurley was 12 years old. His father had already died. He had been placed with family because the people responsible for decisions about his welfare believed that family would protect him. The distance between that assumption and what actually happened inside that home in West Yellowstone is not a small or technical gap. It is an enormous one. And the question that lingers after every verdict in a case like this is never really about the sentence. It is about all the time that passed before anyone made the choice to stop. Case 4. Tiffany Ray Pierce. In late July or early August of 2017, a 23-year-old woman in Missoula, Montana, participated in the killing of 2 people inside the basement of her home on Strand Avenue, including a 15-year-old girl who, according to court admissions, tried to run and could not get out. After both victims were dead, Tiffany Ray Pierce and her accomplice dismembered the bodies, purchased plastic storage tubs and industrial chemicals, placed the remains in the basement, and attempted to dissolve what was left. When investigators arrived weeks later with a search warrant connected to a separate crime, what they found in that basement was so far beyond anything the warrant had prepared them for that those who processed the scene described it as among the most disturbing discoveries in the region's recorded history. There are crimes that shock a community not because violence is unfamiliar to them, but because the nature of what was discovered exceeds what most people believe they will ever encounter in a neighborhood they recognize. Tiffany Ray Pierce was 23 years old at the time. Her victims were Jackson Wiles, 24, and Marilyn Pickett, just 15 years old. The fact that one victim was a teenager, and the fact of what was done to both of them in the aftermath, is what made this case impossible for the Missoula community to set aside. But what truly happened inside that house on Strand Avenue? And how far was someone willing to go to make sure no one found out? Let's dive into what really happened. Tiffany Ray Pierce shared a residence on Strand Avenue in Missoula with Augusta Standing Rock, her partner and accomplice in this crime. The two were living together in a household that also included at least one roommate. Whatever the outward texture of daily life in that house, the events of late July and early August of 2017 would establish it in the public record as the location of a double homicide. The events began, in a sense, not in August, but in July. On July 23, 2017, Pierce and Standing Rock allegedly entered a home on Montana Street in Missoula during what prosecutors described as a home invasion. Pierce allegedly stabbed a woman inside that home 8 times while demanding drugs and money. That earlier incident would later become the thread that led police to Strand Avenue and to the discovery of the August crime. The July stabbing was eventually incorporated into the charges against her. Jackson Wiles was 24 years old. Marilyn Pickett was 15. Those two facts, side by side, tell you something about the nature of what happened in that basement on Strand Avenue. The two were brought to Pierce's home by Standing Rock, who, according to his later admissions in court, had a grievance against Wiles. Prosecutors said Standing Rock believed Wiles had caused serious harm to a young girl close to him. Whatever the specific nature of that belief, it translated into action in the basement of that house. Standing Rock stabbed Wiles. He then handed the knife to Pierce, who used it to stab Pickett. According to Standing Rock's own statements to the court, the 15-year-old tried to escape during the attack. She did not succeed. Pierce was held accountable for her death. The roommate in the house later told police he was awakened that night by a woman's screams. He found Pierce and Standing Rock in the bathroom, cleaning blood from themselves. Pierce allegedly told him there was a deceased person in the basement. What the pair did next is where the case moved into territory that investigators and the broader public found difficult to process. Pierce and Standing Rock dismembered the bodies of both victims. They purchased plastic storage tubs and cleaning chemicals. The remains were placed in those tubs in the basement. The chemicals were intended to dissolve what was left. Investigators who discovered the scene described it as among the most disturbing in the region's recorded history. The remains were only partially degraded by the time police arrived. Identification required dental records and DNA analysis. The discovery happened because police came to the Strand Avenue address to follow up on the July home invasion. They arrived with a search warrant connected to the earlier stabbing. What they found inside went far beyond what that warrant had anticipated. An axe recovered from the property bore human tissue. The knives used in the killings were recovered. The tubs were in the basement. The timeline investigators reconstructed indicated the bodies had been there for days before discovery. Augusta Standing Rock reached a plea agreement in December 2018. He pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide for the death of Wiles and to accountability for the death of Pickett. In open court, he acknowledged handing the knife to Pierce and stated that Pickett had attempted to escape. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms with parole eligibility. Pierce's resolution came in March 2019. She had initially pleaded not guilty and was preparing for trial when a change in circumstances led to a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to attempted deliberate homicide for the July home invasion and to accountability for deliberate homicide in connection with the 2 deaths on Strand Avenue. The plea recommended 2 concurrent life sentences with parole eligibility. She waived her right to appeal as part of the agreement. Sentencing occurred on April 12, 2019, before District Judge James Wheelis in Missoula County. The hearing ran for nearly 90 minutes. Family members of both victims spoke. The families of Jackson Wiles and 15-year-old Marilyn Pickett addressed the court. Pierce wept during the proceedings. She spoke directly about Pickett. She said there was not a day that passed when she did not wish she could take back what had happened. She expressed particular grief about the age of the younger victim. Pierce's father also addressed the court, apologizing on behalf of his family to the victim's relatives. The judge cited the safety of the public as a paramount consideration in imposing 2 concurrent life sentences. No death penalty was sought in this case. Both defendants are serving their sentences in Montana State Prison. The Missoula community that had known Strand Avenue as a residential street now knew it by different reference points entirely. Marilyn Pickett was 15 years old. She had tried to run. That fact, stated plainly in open court by the man who had admitted handing over the knife, does not require elaboration. It only requires acknowledgement. She was 15. She tried to get away, and the house on Strand Avenue did not let her. Case 5. And Marie Stout. On the night of the 9th of June, 2007, a woman in Gardipe, Montana, shot her husband, Bill Stout, in the head while he slept, using a gun she had secretly purchased and reported stolen weeks earlier, and then staged a scene around his body before investigators arrived. But what made this case extraordinary was not just the act itself. It was everything that came before it. Years of anonymous letters, fabricated email accounts, hang-up calls, and a harassment campaign so elaborate and so deliberately constructed that it had already, in advance, created a false suspect living in another state who investigators would spend months ruling out. The planning did not begin the night Bill was killed. It began years earlier. There is a specific kind of case that forensic investigators and behavioral analysts sometimes describe as a slow build. It is a case where the act at the center of it is not the beginning of the story. It is the end of a sequence that started months or even years earlier. The sequence may not look, while it is happening, like the preparation for anything in particular. It may look like a difficult marriage going through a difficult period. It may look like paranoia or jealousy or ordinary marital conflict. Only after the fact, only when investigators begin pulling on threads, does the architecture beneath it become visible. The Anne Marie Stout case is one of the clearest examples of this structure that the Montana court record contains. Bill Stout, Anne's husband and the victim of this disturbing story, had plans to go horseback riding the following morning, and had already called a friend to confirm. The controversy that makes this case unforgettable is not just the crime itself, but the elaborate years-long campaign that preceded it. One so carefully constructed it pointed investigators somewhere else entirely. What was Anne Marie Stout truly building during all those years? And what did she believe it would give her? Let's uncover the details behind this case. Bill Stout was 50 years old. He and Anne Marie Stout lived in a rural area near Gardipe, in Ravalli County, Montana, with their 2 teenage sons. The couple had been together for years. They had built a life in the remote, scenic landscape of western Montana. They had also, like many couples, survived serious pain together. In the year 2000, they lost their oldest son Ben to suicide, a loss that left lasting damage on the marriage, and on Bill in particular. That grief, unresolved and ongoing, formed part of the backdrop of what followed. In 2005, Bill had a brief affair while on a trip to Arkansas. He had known the woman, Barbara Miller, from years earlier. After returning, they continued to exchange contact. Bill bought a plane ticket for Miller to visit Montana, though the visit never occurred, and discovered the affair through an anonymous phone call and confronted her husband. Bill ended contact with Miller. The affair was over. But for Anne, the chapter was not closed. Not by a long distance. What began in the period following the affair was, on its surface, a harassment campaign. Unusual emails arrived at the homes and workplaces of people in the Stout social circle. Letters postmarked from Arkansas arrived suggesting Miller was pregnant or that Bill was in contact with her. Hang-up calls were made. Bill's truck was targeted with eggs and other materials. Bill reported the harassment to law enforcement. He was embarrassed. He felt the persecution was coming from outside the marriage. Investigators later concluded that every part of the campaign had originated from inside it. Emails traced back to Anne's work computer. Calls traced back to a payphone at her workplace. Letters bore her fingerprints, her palm prints, her handwriting, and her DNA on envelope adhesive. She had created an online account in Miller's name. She had conducted internet searches involving Miller and monitored Bill's communications. A note in her handwriting found during the investigation listed, in her own words, really mean things, Bill had said. It was a document of grievance. It had been written and kept. The prosecution's argument at trial was that the campaign served two simultaneous functions. It allowed and to punish Bill for the affair in an ongoing and escalating way. And it created in advance a ready-made alternative suspect in the event that something happened to Bill. If he was found dead and investigators looked for a motive, Barbara Miller, a woman from Arkansas who had apparently been stalking and tormenting the Stout family, would be a natural starting point. The fact that Miller was in Arkansas, with surveillance camera documentation of her presence on the relevant date, was something investigators established early and prosecutors used at trial. On the evening of June 9, 2007, Bill Stout was alone at the couple's home in Gardipe with Anne. Their younger son had gone out. Bill spoke by phone with a friend that evening about plans to go horseback riding the following morning. He fell asleep. He had no indication that the night would end differently from any other. Anne-Marie Stout was arrested and charged with deliberate homicide on June 26, 2007. Forensic evidence recovered at the scene included a latex glove bearing her DNA on the inside and gunshot residue on the outside, found in a laundry hamper beneath wet clothing that smelled of bleach. Bill's own gun, reported stolen in May, had been the weapon. No gunshot residue was found on his hands. The staging of the scene pointed, in the prosecution's view, toward someone who had prepared for what came next. The 3-week trial in Ravalli County District Court in June 2008 featured more than 60 witnesses. Computer forensics, botanical evidence, handwriting analysis, ballistics, and DNA testimony were all presented. Barbara Miller testified and was shown to have had no involvement. The jury deliberated for fewer than 6 hours before returning a verdict of deliberate homicide on June 19th or 20th, 2008. At sentencing on September 28, 2008, Judge Jeffrey Langton imposed a life sentence. He noted Anne's lack of acknowledgement, her continued denial of the reality established by the evidence, and her need for psychological evaluation and treatment, and told the court that Bill had been her best friend. The statement landed differently against the backdrop of what had just been presented over 3 weeks of trial. The conviction was appealed and affirmed by the Montana Supreme Court in 2010 in a decision titled State v. Stout. One justice dissented, raising concerns about the breadth of evidence admitted under Montana's transaction rule. The majority held that the harassment campaign was inextricably connected to the crime itself, that it showed planning, intent, and the deliberate construction of a false suspect. The dissent did not change the outcome. Anne-Marie Stout remains incarcerated at the Montana Women's Prison in Billings. Her case was later featured on Dateline NBC. Bill Stout had plans to go horseback riding the next morning. He had called his friend to confirm. That call was one of the last things he did. Whatever Anne believed about the affair, whatever she felt about the years of marriage that followed, he had no idea the weight of it had reached that particular destination. The distance between what a person shows and what they carry is the subject of this entire case. And in the Stout home near Gardipe, that distance turned out to be very large indeed. Case 6. Leannah Jean Gardipe. On the morning of the 19th of November, 2021, a 34-year-old mother in Missoula, Montana, took a serrated kitchen knife into the bedroom where her 2 young daughters were sleeping and attacked both of them. 5-year-old Namaz and 3-year-old Evelyn both had defensive wounds on their small hands and fingers, signs that they briefly reacted before they lost consciousness. Both children died. After it was over, their mother covered them with bedsheets, then called her own mother on the phone and told her she had saved her babies. Then she called 911 and reported what she had done herself. There are cases that the law is well equipped to process, and there are cases where the law does the best it can with circumstances that resist the categories available to it. The death of 5-year-old Namaz Sandberg and 3-year-old Evelyn Sandberg in Missoula, Montana, on November 19, 2021, belongs to the second category. Their mother was the person who caused their deaths. She also called 911 herself and reported what she had done. She told her own mother on the phone that she had saved her babies. The gap between those two sentences, between saved and what the record documented, is where the entire case lives. Leannah Jean Gardipe was 34 years old that morning. The controversy this case carries is the one their father brought into the courtroom. Weeks before that morning, he had stood before a family court judge and begged not to grant her custody. He predicted exactly what would happen, and he was right. What drove a mother to believe that ending her children's lives was the only way to keep them safe? Let's understand the truth behind what happened that morning. Leannah Jean Gardipe was 34 years old. She had a documented history of mental health challenges that predated the events of November 2021 by years. Prior to that morning, she had sought emergency psychiatric care at a hospital and had, during that visit, made a statement that she was hurting her children. She later described that claim as a product of her mental health condition rather than a literal account of what was occurring at home. Child Protective Services responded. The children were temporarily placed with their father, Travis Sandberg, while Gardipe received treatment. What followed was structured and supervised. Gardipe attended weekly therapy sessions. She met regularly with her physician. She completed a 3-week residential treatment program at a facility in Kalispell. A family court reviewed her progress and eventually granted her primary physical custody of Namaz and Evelyn. Their father received scheduled visitation, 1 day midweek and 2 weekends per month. Travis Sandberg did not accept the decision quietly. He appeared before the court during the proceedings and made his concerns explicit. He pleaded with the judge not to grant her custody. He stated directly that he believed doing so would place the children in danger. His words were heard. The parenting plan was finalized anyway. On the morning of November 19, 2021, Gardipe was alone in the family home on Patty and Drive in Missoula with both children. What she did that morning was driven, according to her own statements and the note found at the scene, by a belief that she was protecting them from harm. She would later tell the court she felt the children were not safe and that she had to protect them permanently. A handwritten note left at the scene read, "It was the only way we all wouldn't burn. Now I'm the only one of us that will." That note, along with her statements to her mother and to the 911 dispatcher, painted a consistent picture of delusional thinking, of an apocalyptic fear that she had translated into a protective act. A serrated steak knife was used. The children were on or near her bed when the attack occurred. Both had defensive wounds on their hands and fingers, suggesting they briefly reacted before losing consciousness. After the attack, Gardipe covered the children with bedsheets and placed them in the bedroom. She contacted her mother by phone. She told her she had saved her babies. When her mother asked if that meant she had killed them, Gardipe began to cry. She then called 911 herself. She told the dispatcher she had stabbed the children that morning and said, "I was supposed to die today." Deputies responded to the house. At some point during the call, Gardipe briefly stepped outside, but then re-entered and locked the door. She told the dispatcher that whatever help was coming, it was not for her, not for what she had done. Investigators found the children deceased. The bloody knife was recovered under the bed. At the threshold of the bedroom, they found the handwritten note. Gardipe was arrested without incident. She was held on bail set at $10 million. The court ordered mental health evaluations as proceedings began. She entered an initial not guilty plea. In August 2023, she changed her plea to guilty on 2 counts of deliberate homicide. Sentencing occurred on November 20th, 2023, the day after the 2nd anniversary of the children's deaths, before District Court Judge Robert Deschamps in Missoula. The judge imposed 2 concurrent life sentences. However, the sentence directed that she be committed to the custody of the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services for mental health treatment rather than to the standard prison system. It was a legal mechanism that reflected the court's recognition of Gardipe's documented psychiatric condition, even as it held her fully accountable under deliberate homicide statutes. Travis Sandberg spoke at sentencing. He described picturing the morning of November 19, 2021, every day. He said he had begged the court not to grant her custody. He said he had no choice in the outcome of those family proceedings. He urged the judge to send her to prison rather than a mental health facility. His grief was evident and his position was clear. The judge, in imposing the DPHHS commitment, acknowledged the psychiatric dimensions of the case in a way that the father found insufficient. Gardipe also spoke at sentencing. She said that her life had revolved around her children. She said she missed them every day and that they visited her in dreams. She said she knew how to ask for help, besides this time. That phrase, besides this time, carries an enormous amount in very few words. It suggests a person who understood, at some level, that there was a threshold she had crossed that no amount of subsequent insight could walk back across. 2 children were gone. The note on the floor told the court what she had believed she was doing. And the father who had stood before a judge and made predictions that proved exact is left to live with the knowledge that he was right, and that being right was not enough. Case 7. Kennedy Rose Aigner. On the evening of the 24th of February, 2024, an argument broke out inside a home on Chicago Road in Shepherd, Montana, between a 22-year-old woman and her 24-year-old partner, the father of their 4-year-old daughter. At some point during that argument, the woman retrieved a .22 caliber pistol and fired a single shot into the man's head. He was transported to a hospital and could not be revived. Then, instead of calling 911 to report a shooting, she hid the firearm in the garage and placed a call to emergency services that described the situation as what appeared to be a drug overdose. It took an autopsy to establish what had actually happened. Some domestic disputes end with voices raised and doors closed harder than usual. Some end with phone calls to family members to process the anger. And some, in a small percentage of cases that the courts and communities around them are left to absorb, end in a way that cannot be reversed the following morning. The case of Kennedy Rose Aigner in Shepherd, Montana, belongs to the last category. Kennedy Rose Aigner was 22 years old the night this happened. Her victim was Quade Flakeger, 24, the father of their shared daughter, and entirely unaware the argument he was in would be his last. What is shocking about this case is not only the act itself, but the decision made immediately after it. What Kennedy Rose Aigner reportedly told first responders, and what was found hidden in the garage. What truly drove Kennedy Rose Aigner to that moment, and what was going through her mind in the seconds that followed. Let's walk through the timeline step by step. Kennedy Rose Aigner and Quade Flakeger, 24, shared a home in Shepherd, in Yellowstone County. Their 4-year-old child lived there with them. The relationship had produced a family in the most basic sense, a shared address, a shared child, a shared daily life in a rural Montana community. What the available record does not include is a detailed picture of the specific tensions that had built between them, or the particular nature of the argument that took place that evening. The case resolved through a plea agreement, which meant the full evidentiary portrait of the relationship's dynamics was never presented publicly in a courtroom. What is documented in court admissions and law enforcement reports is this. During the argument, Aigner retrieved a .22 caliber pistol and fired it once. Flakeger was struck in the head. After the shooting, she placed the weapon in the garage of the property. She did not call 911 to report a shooting. Instead, first responders received a call describing a person suffering from what appeared to be an overdose. Deputies and medical personnel arrived at the Chicago Road home and found Flakieger unresponsive in the residence. They performed CPR. They administered Narcan, which is used in suspected opioid overdose cases. Flakieger was transported to a hospital. He could not be revived. An autopsy later determined the actual cause of death, a gunshot wound to the head. The overdose report and the autopsy findings did not align. That discrepancy opened the investigation into what had actually occurred. Aigner was taken into custody shortly after. Investigators recovered the .22 caliber pistol from the garage where it had been hidden. In a subsequent court hearing, Aigner admitted she had shot Flakieger in the head with a pistol during their argument. She initially entered a not guilty plea at her arraignment in March 2024, with bail set at $500,000. A request from her defense to release her on her own recognizance was denied. She ultimately changed her plea to guilty on the deliberate homicide charge. The plea agreement included a negotiated recommendation of 55 years, and it dismissed both the weapons enhancement and the tampering with evidence charge, which had stemmed from her hiding the firearm in the garage. The resolution of those additional charges in her favor was part of the negotiated outcome of the agreement. Sentencing occurred on July 23, 2025, before Yellowstone County District Court Judge Jessica Fair. The judge accepted the plea agreement and imposed 55 years in the Montana Women's Prison. Aigner was also ordered to pay $2,797 in restitution. She was 24 years old at sentencing. Credible news coverage of the hearing noted the emotional weight of testimony related to the couple's 4-year-old daughter, whose life was permanently altered by the loss of her father and the incarceration of her mother. No death penalty was sought. Montana does not regularly seek capital punishment in single-victim domestic homicide cases absent specific statutory aggravating factors, and none were applicable here. The case drew local attention primarily because of a child left behind, and because of the initial misreporting of the death as an overdose, a detail that underscored the deliberate steps taken in the immediate aftermath to obscure what had occurred. What made the case land the way it did, beyond the facts themselves, was the ordinariness of the setting and the circumstances. Shepherd is not a large community. Chicago Road is a residential address. Quade Flakieger was 24 years old. He had a 4-year-old daughter. He had, by all accounts available in the record, no expectation that the argument he was in would produce a final outcome. Arguments in couples' shared homes happen regularly, every day, everywhere. The moment that separated this one from all the others was a single irreversible decision made during it. That child, 4 years old at the time, growing up now in the aftermath, did not choose the circumstances she was placed inside. She did not choose to lose her father or to have her mother serving a 55-year sentence. She inherited those facts the way children always inherit the consequences of what happens in the households where they live. And that, more than any legal detail or court proceeding, is the part of this case that does not get lighter with time. Case 8. China Rose Dawn Davis. On the night of the 1st of November, 2019, a man named Carl Archer Jr. arrived at a motel room in Ballantine, Montana. He did not know that a woman he was acquainted with had spent the previous weeks arranging the precise conditions for what was about to happen. Identifying the location, recruiting the participants, coordinating the transportation, and specifically encouraging one of those participants to bring a firearm. Within approximately 30 seconds of the door opening, Archer was shot in the head with a shotgun and killed. The woman who had orchestrated every part of the plan did not fire the weapon. She stayed in the room after the shot was fired, reached into the dead man's clothing, and took what she had come for. China Rose Dawn Davis was in her late 20s when she put this plan into action. Her victim, Carl Archer Jr., was 53 years old. The controversy at the heart of this case is the question a Yellowstone County jury answered with a guilty verdict. Can someone be convicted of murder when another person fired the shot? Under Montana's felony murder rule, the answer was yes. What drove China Rose Dawn Davis to set this entire plan in motion? And did she truly believe she understood what she was starting? Let's explore what pushed her this far. Davis was in her late 20s in the fall of 2019. She had a history that included substance dependency, periods of homelessness, and learning difficulties that had shaped the arc of her adult life. She had encountered Carl Archer Jr. in Wolf Point, Montana, earlier that year. Archer was involved in drug trafficking. Davis assisted him in distribution activities. Their working arrangement involved payment in methamphetamine. On one particular trip, a drive to Nevada and back, Davis helped facilitate Archer's activities and expected compensation for the time and distance involved. She believed Archer owed her an ounce of methamphetamine for that trip. He allegedly declined to provide it. The debt, as she understood it, remained outstanding. By late October 2019, Davis had relocated to Billings. She had connected with a man named James Resetter, and the two were living together. Davis stayed in contact with Archer. She believed he still owed her. Eder, according to accounts that emerged in proceedings, became possessive and jealous of Davis's continued connection to Archer. The mixture of perceived financial grievance and interpersonal tension provided the conditions in which the plan took shape. Davis devised what she later admitted was a scheme to take Archer's methamphetamine by force, to recover, through robbery, what she felt was owed to her through the drug arrangement. She persuaded Eder to help. Eder was initially reluctant. Davis's encouragement to bring a firearm was a detail that prosecutors returned to repeatedly throughout the case, because it was that encouragement that transformed a planned confrontation into a potentially lethal one. Eder enlisted a third man, Charlie Reimers, who provided a vehicle and a shotgun. Reimers would act as a driver and would not enter the room. On November 1st or 2nd, 2019, Archer arrived at a motel in Ballantine, Montana, the Tiger Town Inn, with an amount of methamphetamine, and his girlfriend Morgan Long Davis was with him. She texted Eder the location. Eder and Reimers arrived. Eder entered the motel room. Within approximately 30 seconds of entering, he shot Archer in the head with the shotgun. He then left. Reimers drove him away. Davis remained in the room after the shot was fired. She reached into Archer's clothing and took the methamphetamine. She then attempted to leave with Long. When law enforcement eventually responded to the scene, Archer was found deceased from the gunshot wound. Davis initially spoke to officers without fully disclosing her role. 7 months later, in 2020, she came forward and admitted her involvement, including her planning role and her encouragement that Eder bring a weapon. Her trial took place in Yellowstone County District Court in September 2021. The prosecution relied on her own admissions, text messages, and witness testimony. A jury convicted her of deliberate homicide under Montana's felony murder statute, which holds participants in a planned forcible felony, such as robbery, accountable for deaths that result from that felony, even when another person fired the weapon. A weapons enhancement was added to the charge. She was sentenced in February 2022 to 80 years for the homicide conviction, plus 5 consecutive years for the enhancement, totaling 85 years. The judge's words at sentencing are part of the record, but for China's actions and involvement, I do think that Carl Archer would still be alive. That sentence represented the court's complete view of where the chain of causation began. Not with the shot, with the plan. Co-defendant James Reese Eder pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide and received a lengthy prison sentence. Charlie Reimers, as the driver who did not enter the room, pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of robbery by accountability and received 15 years with 10 years suspended, reflecting his more limited, direct involvement. Davis appealed her conviction and sentence. The Montana Supreme Court upheld both in a decision issued in 2024. She died in custody on July 21, 2025, at age 34, after a medical emergency at the Montana Women's Prison. She was transported to a hospital in Billings, where she was pronounced dead. Carl Archer Jr. was 53 years old. He was in a motel room when the door opened. Whatever his own history involved, and the drug trade that surrounded this case makes it clear that his life had its own complicated dimensions. He was not given a choice about what happened next. That is the element the felony murder rule is designed to address. The plan that put the gun in the room is not separate from the shot. The law treats them as one continuous act. And so did the court. Case 9. Justine Winter. On the evening of the 19th of March, 2009, a 16-year-old girl in Flathead County, Montana, left her boyfriend's home after an argument, got behind the wheel of her Pontiac Grand AM, and, according to crash reconstruction experts and a witness on the scene, she accelerated to approximately 85 miles per hour and steered her vehicle across the center line into oncoming traffic on U.S. Highway 93. She collided and crashed into another car carrying a 35-year-old woman who was 4 months pregnant at the time. And this innocent woman was with her 13-year-old son. Both the 35-year-old woman and her 13-year-old son were killed on the spot. The unborn child was also lost, but Justine Winter survived. And in the minutes before the crash, she had sent text messages to her boyfriend that prosecutors would later read aloud in court. Justine Winter was 16 years old on the night that changed multiple families forever. Her victims were Aaron Julie Thompson, 35, 4 months pregnant, and Aaron's son, Caden Vincent Odell, just 13 years old. The controversy that still surrounds this case extends well beyond the crash itself, into what happened in the civil courts in the weeks immediately after. A detail that left many people far angrier than the original criminal verdict. What was Justine Winter feeling in those final seconds before impact? Was it just an accident in the heat of the moment, or was this truly a decision? Let's piece together the events of this case. Justine Winter was a student at Glacier High School in Evergreen, a community adjacent to Kalispell in northwestern Montana. She was 16 years old in the early spring of 2009. On the evening of that March 19th, she was at the home of her boyfriend, Ryan Langford. The two argued. The argument led to a breakup. She left his house in her Pontiac Grand AM, alone in the dark, in a state of acute emotional distress that the text messages she sent in the minutes that followed would document in detail. Those text messages became the central evidence in the case that prosecutors built. Winter sent messages to Langford after leaving his house. The content of those messages communicated that she intended to end her life by using her vehicle. The messages were not interpreted at trial as figures of speech or casual venting. They were framed by prosecutors as a stated plan made minutes before the crash. The timeline between the last message sent and the moment of impact was short. The texts arrived. The collision followed. Winter was driving southbound on U.S. Highway 93, a major artery through the Flathead Valley. She was approaching an area near a construction zone and an overpass at the intersection of Church Drive. Her speed, according to investigators and reconstruction experts, was approximately 85 miles per hour. She steered her vehicle across the center line into the northbound lane. Aaron Julie Thompson was 35 years old. She was 4 months pregnant. She was traveling northbound in a Subaru Forester with her 13-year-old son, Caden Vincent Odell, who was a middle school student. The two vehicles met head-on. The force of the impact at combined speed was catastrophic. Aaron Thompson and Caden Odell were both killed. The unborn child also perished. Winter was ejected or otherwise severely injured. Some reports noted she was not wearing a seatbelt and sustained a traumatic brain injury. She spent 47 days in intensive care at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. She survived. They did not. The investigation that followed the crash recovered the text messages from Winter's phone. Crash reconstruction experts examined skid marks, impact angles, vehicle damage, and road evidence. An eyewitness was located. The evidence presented at trial supported the prosecution's position that Winter had crossed the center line deliberately rather than through any mechanical failure, distraction, or external road hazard. The defense argued the collision might have been accidental. They pointed to the construction zone, road conditions, and the possibility that Thompson's vehicle had crossed into Winter's lane. The crash reconstruction and eyewitness testimony contradicted that version. Winter maintained she had no memory of a crash, which she attributed to the traumatic brain injury she had sustained. Winter was charged as an adult and tried in Flathead County District Court over 9 days in early 2011. The jury heard the text messages. They heard from crash reconstruction experts. They heard from the eyewitness. They deliberated for approximately 5 hours and returned unanimous guilty verdicts on both counts of deliberate homicide on February 3, 2011. A significant controversy arose in the civil proceedings that accompanied the criminal case. A lawsuit was filed with the involvement of Winter's father, as she was a minor, against the estate of Aaron Thompson and construction companies connected to the highway project. The suit alleged Thompson had been driving negligently and had caused the crash herself. The families of the victims responded with outrage. The suit was withdrawn the day after the criminal conviction was returned. Its brief existence remained a sore point for those who followed the case. Sentencing occurred on June 6, 2011, before Judge Catherine Curtis. Winter expressed sorrow and maintained she was uncertain about whether the crash had been intentional. That uncertainty, delivered at the moment the families of Aaron Thompson and Caden Odell were hoping for something more direct, drew criticism. She received 2 concurrent 30-year sentences with 15 years suspended on each, effectively making 15 years the portion to serve. Her youth, her lack of prior record, and judicial discretion in Montana's sentencing framework for juvenile offenders tried as adults all contributed to the outcome. Parole was denied in 2014. The board granted it in 2015. She completed a pre-release program and was released on November 20, 2015, at age 22. Some community members viewed the outcome as disproportionately lenient. Others pointed to her age and medical circumstances as appropriate mitigating factors. She later sent a letter expressing remorse, which reached some of those affected by the crash. Aaron Thompson was 35. Caden Odell was 13. The road they were traveling that evening was their road too, northbound, in their lane, returning from wherever they had been. The crash came at them from the opposite direction. None of what happened to them was connected to the argument on Chicago Road or the text messages sent in its aftermath. They simply happened to be in that lane, in that moment, when the car came across. Case 10. Danielle, Janette Wood. This is the gripping account of a Montana woman who, on the evening of the 2nd of May, 2018, allegedly drove across a mountain range in the dark from her home in Polson across the Cabinet Mountains and into Sanders County, approached the rural property of her former partner, and shot him 3 times outside his own home. Then she drove back through those same mountains, returned to a gathering she had been hosting at her house, and went on with her evening. It was a co-worker, arriving the following afternoon after Lafreniere failed to show up for work, who found him lying face down in his own driveway, partially covered by a sheet of plywood and already cold. Danielle Janette Wood was in her early to mid-50s when the crime occurred in May of 2018. Her victim was Matthew George Lafreniere, 50 years old, a man who had spent years in a contentious custody battle with Wood over the daughter they shared, and who held primary custody of that child at the time of his death. This case included a near year-long investigation built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, a 100-year sentence with no possibility of parole, and a conviction that was later overturned by the Montana Supreme Court on procedural grounds, sending the case back to trial while Wood continued to insist, as she always had, that she had nothing to do with his death. What was Danielle Janette Wood truly willing to do to change the outcome of a custody battle she had been losing for years? And did she actually do it? Let's take a closer look at how it all unfolded. Matthew George Lafreniere was 50 years old. He and Danielle Janette Wood, then in her early to mid-50s, had a shared daughter. Lafreniere had primary custody of that child, the result of years of contentious family court proceedings between the two former partners. That custody arrangement was the context in which everything that followed occurred. Whether it was also the motive is the question that a second trial is now expected to address. On the evening of May 2, 2018, Wood was at her home in Polson, where she was hosting a gathering connected to the sale of kitchen products. She left that gathering for a period of time. Witnesses in the Thompson Falls area across the mountains from Polson in Sanders County reported hearing gunshots near Lafreniere's home around the same time. The following afternoon, a co-worker stopped by the property after Lafreniere did not arrive for work. He was found in his driveway, face down and unresponsive, partially covered by a piece of plywood. He had been shot 3 times. The wounds to his chest and back were fatal. A wound to his hand was also noted. The investigation that followed took nearly a year. Investigators looked at Wood's movements, communications, and purchasing history. They identified that she had purchased a .38 caliber revolver in March of 2018, approximately 6 weeks before the shooting. They recovered a prepaid cell phone that prosecutors characterized as a secondary communication device purchased for the purpose of misdirecting investigators or communicating with Lafreniere away from traceable channels. Cell site data and Wi-Fi tracking showed both her primary phone and the prepaid device moving in close proximity, including in patterns consistent with travel in the direction of Thompson Falls. An entry in a planner, made on the date she purchased the gun, had been crossed out and replaced with the words "Sweet Bliss," which the prosecution offered as evidence of her mental state regarding the purchase. A ballistics analysis connected a recovered bullet fragment to the .38 caliber ammunition type. Wood was arrested in March 2019. She entered a not guilty plea. At trial in Sanders County District Court in January 2021, the prosecution presented its theory under 2 frameworks: that Wood was the direct shooter, and, as an alternative, that she had aided or abetted another person who had not been publicly identified or charged. The defense challenged the strength of the circumstantial case and argued the state had not proven identity beyond a reasonable doubt. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting itself. The case rested on physical evidence, phone data, and timing. The jury convicted her of deliberate homicide on January 29, 2021. She was sentenced on March 2, 2021, by Judge Deborah Christopher. Prosecutors had asked for the maximum 100 years. The defense had requested 10. The judge imposed 100 years with no parole eligibility. At sentencing, Wood again proclaimed her innocence. She told the court she had not killed Lafreniere and had not helped anyone do so. The judge imposed the maximum sentence, while noting her resistance to acknowledging the verdict. The appeal that followed focused not on the sufficiency of the evidence, but on the mechanics of the trial itself. Because Wood had been charged under both direct liability and accountability theories, direct shooter or accomplice to an unnamed person, her defense had requested that the verdict form require the jury to specify which theory they had found proven. The court had used a general verdict form instead. In December 2024, the Montana Supreme Court ruled that this was an error that could have produced a non-unanimous verdict on the underlying theory of liability, violating Wood's constitutional rights. The court reversed the conviction and ordered a new trial on the direct liability theory. Subsequent proceedings included Wood's motion to dismiss the case on double jeopardy grounds, which the Supreme Court denied in 2025. Trial dates have been set and subsequently vacated as of available reporting. The gun connected to the case was recovered from the Clark Fork River after the original conviction, but before the appeal, a discovery that did not alter the appellate outcome. After the death of Matthew Lafreniere, the child the two had shared grew up without her father in her life. Wood was in prison. Lafreniere was gone. The custody dispute that had defined years of their interactions had been resolved by circumstance in a way that the courts never intended. And the daughter at the center of that years-long legal battle was left to absorb a version of events that even the courts, as of 2025, had not fully resolved in writing. The legal process continues. The outcome of it remains open. What is not open is the fact that Matthew Lafreniere was found in his driveway on May 3, 2018, and did not get up again. Thank you for watching.